forget. We are on recording right now. So as I said, a quick introduction in case you're here for the first time. So my name is Martin. I work for a company called Agile Cockpit as an Agile coach. I've been doing so for the past 6 years. More than 6 years now. And I'm also a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org, meaning that I am licensed to teach Scrum Master and product owner classes, and I do so with a lot of joy. I have a history background as a software and DevOps engineer, so really the technical side of things, and kind of segued into being a Scrum Master about 12 years ago, and the rest is history. And I'm currently spearheading the US expansion of Agile Cockpit. Agile Cockpit is an Agile coaching consulting firm specialized in on-the-job coaching and trainings. We do also provide a little bit of software to back that up. In case you want to learn more about me or Agile Cockpit, you can find me on LinkedIn, same with the company, and I'm always happy to chat. So a couple of things about the meetup today. The outline is really brief because we're really going to go over the Scrum Framework, and that's more than enough in itself. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background information. I do encourage participation during this meetup. So in case you have any questions or remarks or suggestions or experiences to share, feel free to either speak up or write down in chat. I do pause at certain times for questions, so I can go over the chat and answer any questions that are in there. Additionally, as I said, the meetup is being recorded. It's going to be shared in the meetup group tomorrow. It's going to be in our YouTube channel where you can find the other meetups that we have had. Additionally, the slides are also going to be shared. And not that today's slide deck is going to be that dramatic given the topic, but regardless, it's going to be shared online. So I guess that's all with regards to the introductions. Any questions so far? All right, so let's get started. A lot of ground to cover. So first, let's go over a little bit of background information about Scrum in case this is really the first time you are hearing about it. So I guess the origin of this all goes back to 1986 when two gentlemen published a paper on, ultimately it got published in the Harvard Business Review. Not sure if that was around in that capacity in 1986. And it's called the New Product Development Game. And it really goes to the core of how we traditionally approach development and like what new, more iterative, agile approaches could be. And that sort of got picked up by the industry, and Ken Schraber and Jeff Sutherland were working together. I think it was at Borland, not really sure anymore. And they sort of started working with this. And in 1995, they really got their heads together in basements in Burlington, Massachusetts. And that's where they created what could be described as like the first Scrum guide. It was a lot more prescriptive than what is out there right now. I mean, I think it was over 60 pages. I'm not really sure. It's not very well published anymore, that version. Right now it's back to 13. So we're down to 13 pages. So yeah, 1995 is first Scrum guide. And then in 2002, actually, the Scrum Alliance was founded. And that's a year after the Agile Manifesto got created, which was in 2001. And then that sort of became bigger. And I'd say in 2009, which is 12 years ago, the first official Scrum guide as we know it got created. And with first official, I mean like Scrum in the way it is right now. It underwent like a couple of changes over the past couple of years, like every 3-ish years goes over some changes. And the last revision of that, the latest revision was in 2020, last year. So one step in between there, like the same year, the first official Scrum guide came out. Scrum certification sort of split up into two paths. So you had the Scrum Alliance, which had been around since 2002, and that's now owned by Jeff Sutherland and his son. And then in 2009, Kent Schraber left the Scrum Alliance and created Scrum.org because he had a different view on how we should approach certification of Scrum Masters and product owners. So in case you want to get certified, There's two different ways to get it. So the Scrum Alliance has their certified Scrum Master, product owner, et cetera, and Scrum Network has their professional Scrum Master, Scrum product owner, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm not going to go any deeper than that. I mean, just know that it's out there. But there's two organizations really looking out for that Scrum Guide, and they do, even though they offer like competing certification paths, they do really collaborate in those new revisions. Ken and Jeff still collaborate on those new revisions of the Scrum Guide. So that's just a little bit of brief history there, a little bit of a timeline. So what is Scrum? They changed the definition last year, actually. So it used to be something around software development, and now it's a lightweight framework that helps people, teams, and organizations generate value through adaptive solutions for complex problems. Even though I agree that it is technically a very good definition, personally, I would say it's a framework for continuous value delivery in complex environments. The whole purpose of Scrum is recognizing, it sort of got born out of the recognition that software development and creative product development is in a complex space with more unknowns than knowns. And that's what Scrum really is a solution for. So I think that's where it properly fits, and it's all focused on value delivery, just like the Agile Manifesto. So that's really the gist of it. And one of the key powers, I would say, of Scrum is that it's extremely lightweight. There are not a lot of rules. There's not a lot prescribed in the Scrum Guide. It's incredibly easy to understand and get started with, right? You could read the Scrum Guide and get started like right after you read it, right? And because it's so simple to understand. However, it is very difficult to master. And a lot of what I've seen, a lot of what other people have seen over the past, I'd say 2 decades, is that when organizations start with Scrum, they're doing small bits and pieces, right? But it takes them a couple of years to become really good at it. And that's perfectly okay. I guess that's also part of the intention behind this. I mean, it's an iterative process as well. They get used to this. Obviously, there's ways to speed it up. But that's like the upside, and at the same time, a little bit of the, I'd say the pitfall. Like people think like, hey, we're doing Scrum because we're having a daily Scrum, and that's not technically true. Yes, you're doing a daily Scrum, for example, but you're not yet operating as the full intention, according to the full intention of the Scrum Guide. And that's where it becomes really tricky, because that true intention, that's a little bit out there. It's like not hard, not really, doesn't really have a hard definition in there. So if you're doing Scrum, if you're starting with Scrum, or even if you've been doing it for a while, it's perfectly okay if you're not 100% perfect at it. It's a process. It's a continuous improvement process, as it were. So before we really move on to the Scrum Framework itself and start talking about all the bits and pieces, I want to take a little bit of a sidestep to talk about Scrum and Agile, because those words are often mentioned in the same sentence. Sometimes people are talking about Agile Scrum or Scrum Agile, or it's like the same word, or it's capitalized or whatever. Scrum is not an abbreviation. That's that, first of all, and Scrum and Agile are actually different things. So Agile, as we use it in this context, is defined in the Agile Manifesto. Again, goes back to 2001, signed by, I think, 12, but it might be 14 people from the software industry, among which Ken and Jeff, the founders of Scrum. Again, Scrum was there first, and that really focuses on the values and principles of Agile organizations, of Agile software development. You could even say Agile product development. And that focuses on mindset and behavior. Scrum is a framework that focuses on values and then practices, some practices that are in there. And we'll go over them like in the next section. So basically, Scrum is an implementation of Agile. It's a way to be Agile. However, if you want to be really Agile as an organization, Scrum alone is never going to get you there. You might need frameworks or other tools or methods or methodologies like SAFe, the Skilled Agile framework, Kanban, a really popular like add-on to Scrum. Extreme programming goes back to 1998. A whole bunch of development practices in there. Nexus, another scaling approach. You also got less. You've got Scrum at Scale and all these kind of things. And I'm sure if you look further, there's going to be a lot more bits and pieces that you're going to need in order to be truly Agile. So I just want to put that out there. And I had some interesting conversations recently, worth mentioning this. And during all those conversations, I was asked questions about how do we measure this? How do we measure that? How would you solve this? How would you solve that? And the majority of those answers, I noticed I was going back to Kanban, right? So if you're using Scrum or you're looking for things like how do we measure the team? How do we make sure that we have more data on which to base our decisions? I would say Kanban is a really good add-on. I might do a next meetup on Kanban actually, go over that again, a combination, interesting thought. So that's really something that you might want to look at. It's like the most common thing you do if you're using Scrum, focus on Kanban. Kanban, essentially visualize your flow, limit your work in progress, and make sure you optimize that flow, which is helpful because Scrum doesn't really offer you that in that sense. It just offers you things to make that transparent and a bunch of feedback loops. Right, so very quickly there, I went over like a lot of background information. So I am going to pause briefly, see if there's any questions before I move on to exploring Scrum. I am not seeing or hearing any questions. Let me double check whether my audio is actually good. Yeah, it is. Samantha, welcome back. Didn't see you there. Scrum comes from rugby. Yes, absolutely. What's in the name? Yeah, it really comes from the rugby, like the huddle they have there. Not a rugby expert by any means, but that's definitely where it came from. Like sort of originated with like the whole team standing around that board and focusing on the same goal. Great addition. Yeah. Good. So let's move on to exploring the Scrum framework. And if you've gone over this before, any Scrum training before, it is going to be a little bit different because there used to be 11 ingredients, and I'd argue there are still 11 official ingredients to Scrum. However, they sort of added 3 unofficial ingredients, which are tied to 3 official ingredients. And this will become more apparent soon. So Scrum has 3 roles to begin with. And I say roles here just for clarifications. In the Scrum Guide, they talk more about accountabilities, right? So you have the product owner whose accountability is the product and the product backlog, making sure he or she optimizes value delivery. The Scrum Master, whereas the product owner is completely responsible for product, and accountable, the Scrum Master is accountable for Scrum, for the process, right? For making sure that the Scrum team operates smoothly and all kinds of other organizational bits and pieces are in place. And then there's the last role or accountability, and that's called developers. And this used to be called development team. The combination of these 3 make up the Scrum team, and that's the team that does Scrum. And now if you go back to what I said just now about developers being called the development team, in the past, you used to have like 2 teams, so to speak. And that caused a lot of confusion, right? There were words out there like self-managing, self-organizing. One was self-managing, the other was self-organizing, caused a whole bunch of confusion, right? The team within a team setup. So they changed development team to developers. And developers means anybody that you need to develop the product, right? It's not limited to software developers in case you're in an IT environment, but it's also not limited to software specific roles, right? A marketing team could have developers as well. Those are just the people developing marketing campaigns or web pages or brochures. It doesn't really matter, right? So those are the people really doing the work that creates value. So they're ultimately responsible and accountable for value delivery, right? So product owner accountable for product, Scrum Master for Scrum, and then developers for value delivery. And the combination of this, again, is the Scrum team, a self-managing Scrum team, because you have all the roles and all the accountabilities in order to be completely self-managing and independent. So I see a question in chat. I'm gonna answer that question, get to that once I've gone over these 11 plus the 3 things. But I do definitely have some interesting thoughts, and I'm sure some of the participants do have to. So 3 roles / accountabilities out of the way. Now we're gonna get to the interesting part. Scrum also has 3 artifacts, And this is where the +3 sort of starts coming in. So the first artifact is the product backlog, which is essentially a work repository for a product, right? A product always has one product backlog that greatly enhances, increases transparency. So you really know what's the pipeline for that single product. And if it's on there, there is a very reasonable chance something's going to be worked on. If it's not on there, it's like nowhere. So it's not being picked up or looked at in that sense. The product backlog is owned by the product owner. And it's a long-term thing. I usually say between like 3 to 6 months ahead. That's the amount of work you want to have in your product backlog. That gives you like a right amount to forecast, and it really helps you create transparency as well and like know what you have to work on. So the product backlog has a commitment attached to it. And these are the new 3 things in the Scrum Guide of 2020. So those commitments are tied to artifacts, and a commitment is a product goal. So a Scrum team gives a commitment to a product goal, and a product goal is a longer term goal for a product that the product owner wants to achieve. It's sort of like a vision, but then maybe word it a little bit more concretely, a little bit more to the point, making sure like, hey, this is actually where we want to get. Whereas a vision could be a little bit more wishful. So I'd say you can still have your overall product vision for a little bit longer term, but your product goal is really tied to that product backlog. So it should be 3 to 6 months ahead, basically. And as you have one product backlog per product, you also have one product goal per product. So it's a singular thing that you're focusing on in the medium term, I'd say. And it does provide a lot of focus. That's the whole point. It does provide like a yardstick against which to measure, like, what is our progress that we're actually making towards achieving this? And once you've either achieved it or abandoned it, it's going to be replaced with a new product goal. So that's one of the new additions. So first artifact, product backlog with its product goal. So the product backlog has a little brother or sister called the sprint backlog, whereas the product backlog is really focused on the product itself. The sprint backlog is focused on the sprint, that iteration, like that. We always say that 1 to 4 week period in which the Scrum team works on a sprint backlog, and with that, a sprint goal. So the iteration, just want to emphasize that technically the sprint is 30 days or less, 1 month or less. However, we always say 1 to 4 weeks because from a planning perspective, that's typically easier and it's easier to comprehend, I'd say. So that sprint backlog is your work repository for the sprint, and that's what the developers work on. So the product owner owns a product backlog. The developers actually own the sprint backlog. And attached to that sprint backlog is a sprint goal. And as with product backlog and product goal, that sprint goal is set to provide overarching direction within that sprint. So it's a goal that you want to achieve within a sprint. So the goal is, what do you want to achieve? And the sprint backlog is your plan, how you think you're going to get there, right? So that can change. Your sprint backlog can change. Your sprint goal, however, does not. And that's where it's a little bit different from the product goal, because if you say you don't want to change your product goal, you're not really being agile, right? Because business needs can change. Your sprint goal always remains the same within the sprint, unless the product owner decides it's obsolete, and that's when you cancel a sprint, et cetera, et cetera. Not something that very commonly happens. Some people have not had it happen at all over the course of 10 years because sprints are typically an average like 2 weeks in length across organizations that we've been polling. So what changes in 2 weeks if the sprint goal becomes obsolete? Typically not that much, right? So sprint goal, overarching direction, sprint backlog, how to get there. And then the final artifact is called the increment. And this used to be called potentially shippable product. And that term made it easy to understand what this actually was, but the danger was that it gave some sort of suggestion that it was something finite, that you were really done at one point. And the whole point of especially software development is that you're never really done, right? Your product exists until you decide to pull the plug on it. Even if you're not actively developing it, you're likely going to have maintenance costs, support costs, et cetera, right? So, and they really wanted to put that out there. So the increment is just like the latest state of your product as it is at one point in time. sort of like the snapshot of how it is right now. And that can constantly change throughout a sprint. It should actually. And attached to that increment is your definition of done, which is truly how you know when you're done, or at least when you what you consider to be done, and provides again some sort of measuring stick, like, are we there yet? Is this piece of functionality that we've been working on, is that now part of the increment, yes or no? Can we consider it to be done? And the definition of done is sort of like your checklist that contains stuff like it should be tested, font size should be this or this, uptime should be this or this, there should be documentation, it should adhere to certain rules and regulations, those kind of things, and that really help you identify whether you are done. So again, it's a commitment with regards to the increment. And that's really how this works. So the three artifacts with their three commitments: product backlog, product goal, sprint backlog, sprint goal, an increment, and the definition of done. So the last bit was one of the more major changes of the last Scrum guide. Something that really did not change were the 5 events. They're still all there. Like I mentioned before, this sprint, the 1 month or less, overall time box within everything happens, right? Sprints run at a consistent length for as long as it makes sense. And it's just an overall time box, right? So say your sprint starts next Monday and ends like Friday the week after, then the next sprint starts the Monday after. Like, they just run back to back and go on and on. Like I mentioned before, the average sprint length based on the past 6 years of polling right now, I can safely say, is 2 weeks. Very occasionally, there's an organization that does like 1 week sprints. I've worked for one of those. I am a big fan of that, but I do recognize it really doesn't work for every organization. Some of them do 3 or 4 weeks, but that's rarer and rarer. I really don't see that happen quite frequently. So within that sprint overall time box, there's a couple of other things that happen. I actually see a comment right here. I'm just gonna call that out there. So Max is saying it's 3 weeks for us, but each one sprint may span 2 releases. So you're releasing more often inside a sprint. And that's actually a very good remark, because sprint length doesn't say anything about releases, right? You can release anytime you want. That's ultimately a product owner decision. So sprint length is just your overall feedback loop, right? Just there as a safeguard to make sure you're not going on too long without very explicit feedback loops and maybe some planning sessions, right? So say you have that sprint time box, there's a couple of things happening inside that for sure that are part of Scrum. So the first one of them is sprint planning. Sprint planning is the first thing that happens in a sprint, and it's where you go over like, what do we want to achieve and how do we think we're going to get there in this sprint. That's also the point in time where your sprint goal is being crafted and where the sprint backlog is being filled. A little bit more detail on that in a second. The other thing you have inside your sprint is your daily Scrum. So start of sprint is that sprint planning, and then the developers start working, and every day they have their daily Scrum to check their progress toward their sprint goal. And they make adaptations during the daily Scrum to their sprint backlog as needed. At the end of the sprint, once you get there, you have your sprint review, which is really looking back at what did we achieve with regards to the product, like what new functionality did we add, what value did we add, basically, and looking ahead, given where we are right now, what would be the most sensible thing to move forward. And then finally, once you've done that product bit, there's that process bit called the sprint retrospective, where you look at the process and the way you have collaborated. So that's really where you, as a Scrum team, look at how you can make Scrum more fun, better, and make it work for you. So these are actually all the 5 Scrum events. So I'm going to pause here, see if there's any additional questions. Meanwhile, I'm going to go back to the questions that have already been asked in here. So Sandy asked, is Scrum used primarily in software development? What other industry uses Scrum most often? I would say yes, software development is definitely the one where Scrum is biggest. My personal experience, I've seen quite some banks use it outside of IT teams as well. So that would be finance teams, sales teams and marketing teams. I've seen it work for those as well, especially in smaller organizations. It really quickly spreads to other teams as well. And I wouldn't say for all kinds of different disciplines it works exactly the same as for software development, right? So for sales, it might be a little bit different. For example, marketing is probably closer to software development. It's being used throughout, I'd say, but definitely the majority of which is in software development. I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to follow up on that. So Khalid, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, my apologies. What popular companies are utilizing it? I'd say that really depends on your definition of popular companies, but I'd say a lot of the big companies out there are definitely using it. If you're talking in your financials, I know Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, all the big banks. I'm sure all the smaller banks are using it too. If you're talking your Googles, your Facebooks, your Microsofts, your Apples, they're all using, I'd say, agile methodologies. I'm not saying I know for sure they all use Scrum according to the book. I know Microsoft is definitely really good at that, at this. I know that for sure. So if you're talking your big names, I'd say they are definitely a lot of big companies out there using it. I have to say that comes with a huge disclaimer though, because they all have experience with this, and organizations like Microsoft are huge, complex organizations. So they typically have adapted their ways of working. Another example of an agile organization is Spotify. They shared a lot of that content online. If you go back to the Meetup page and go back to an earlier meetup we had this year in the Spotify model, there's some background information there as well on how they do agile and how they use it. So I'd say definitely lots of there that are using it. Phil is asking, I think Samantha already answered that, but let's go over it very quickly. Please clear my confusion regarding the certification and Scrum accountabilities. I see that Scrum Master is the initial certification. Particularly for me, I'm a software developer. So what I want to say about that, if you look at the accountabilities, so product owner focuses on product, and that's more of a, that's where like the whole discipline of product management comes in. Developers are typically considered to be technical people or people with a lot of domain knowledge, and the Scrum Master's accountability is Scrum. So if you want to learn more about Scrum, the natural path is a Scrum Master certification, a Scrum Master class, because that really covers the Scrum framework in depth. So my suggestion, if you want to learn more about Scrum, a Scrum Master class is a great way to get started. There are also like Scrum in practice classes, like Agile, Scrum that recently changed their name. It used to be called Professional Scrum Foundations, which is more like an experience-based class for you and your team to understand how Scrum really works on like a team level. My experience though, it's that typically not as popular as a Scrum Master class because it comes with the same certification. And so Scrum Master is usually a good path if you're considering that. So Samantha saying Scrum work in short time frames called sprints. So the time frame is a sprint and not an event. I know there's a lot of opinions out there about whether a sprint should be an event, yes or no. In the Scrum guide, they are defining it as an event. And so for the purposes, like if you want to know the official answer, and if you're ever going to take the assessments or go for certification, they are going to consider Scrum to be actually an event. However, the contention is because it's an overall time box, people typically look at it differently from the other four. Whenever I ask this question in a class and they ask for the 5 events, people always come up with planning, daily Scrum, review, retrospective, and the sprint is always one I have to add myself. However, Ken and Jeff decided to leave sprint in there as an event. Not a lot I can do, unfortunately.
We talked about this before.
I know.
Not an event.
I know.
I think what's missing is backlog refinement.
Yes, and that's missing for a very good reason, because they sort of knocked it out of the Scrum guide in their latest, in the last version. Backlog refinement has always considered to be an activity.
That's an event.
It's not an event according to the Scrum guide. I know
Yeah.
there's material out there that says something else, which is perfectly fine. However, according to the Scrum Guide, backlog refinement is definitely not considered an event. It hasn't been. And they even made it a lot less apparent in the latest version of the Scrum Guide. There used to be a little bit of a section called about refinement, and they totally took that out. I think the word is like mentioned in passing, in the sense that the product backlog is continuously refined by the Scrum team. And
Well, that's the choice of the team, right? Because these events
yes,
are around the structure of Scrum versus, hey, I'm going to do a refinement with my team and I can choose to do it whenever I want.
exactly, David, exactly. That's their reasoning behind it, that it shouldn't be defined for them. I mean, there's a very good reason why sprint planning is the first thing you do in a sprint, and why review and retrospective are the last things you do, and why the daily Scrum has to happen on a daily basis. Teams do refinement at different times whenever day feels appropriate for them. I've been in a Scrum team where we used to do it every day after daily Scrum for 15 to 30 minutes. There's teams that do it every week. There's teams that just do it more organically. So and that's the biggest driver behind, like, hey, it just needs to happen. It's just going to be totally up to you on how you do it. And there's a lot of great practices out there, though. Product backlog refinement used to be called grooming. David, I sense a little bit of a British accent there. So, and I recognize the
Yeah,
giggle.
I certainly know what you're talking about.
Yeah, grooming has
Also,
gotten,
before that, it was pre-sprint planning, but I know where you're going with grooming.
yeah, grooming has gotten a little bit of a different meaning, at least in British English. It didn't really blow over to North America in that sense. It's considered a bad word, I'd say, in British English. So that's when I changed product backlog.
But it's a big PC word, right?
Definitely, yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, so there again, there's quite some material out there where it's still called grooming. That's not the official term anymore. And to the point I just made, the latest version of Scrum, like, it really got taken out of the Scrum Guide. So Samantha is adding a very good comment there, that refinement is actually done with the entire team, right? The product owner owns the backlog, so they should make sure that the team understands what's in there and what needs to happen, and the team helps uncover like more detail about what needs to happen. So it's an ongoing activity there. I'm going to answer that last question before I move on to this. What kind of work experience would one need to become a Scrum Master? You're probably not going to like the answer. I would say Scrum Master experience if you're really looking for a job as a Scrum Master. I've worked with quite some people over the past couple of months that are looking to become a Scrum Master as like a job, and they have limited experience. So it's really hard for them because they don't have that. My suggestion, if you want to become a Scrum Master, is I'd say there's no true pre-qualifications. You'd say definitely need an open mind and a willingness to learn, and then you can just step into it and see what it's like to be a Scrum Master. That's how I rolled into it, and that's how other people rolled into it. I do have to say that I've seen quite some people coming from the change management corner or the psychology corner that became a Scrum Master. Feels like a natural path because of the nature of the work, but I wouldn't say that's a hard path. That's just my personal experience, and your mileage may really vary. Other people might have very different experiences. So if you are in a position where you want to become a Scrum Master and you have the opportunity to pick that up, I'd say that's it. Start reading about it, start becoming a Scrum Master, maybe take a class, get a certification that might help speed certain things up, right? A quick injection of knowledge, but in the end, it's all about experience. All right, a little bit of a focus on some of the other changes made in the recent Scrum Guide that might be relevant, and then we're going to go over the full flow of the Scrum Framework. So self-managing Scrum team, I already mentioned this in the previous slide. Before, you used to have a self-managing Scrum team and a self-organizing development team. That's sort of how it was explained anyway. Right now, there's just one self-managing Scrum team who should be able to operate completely independent. Again, big disclaimer, this is the Scrum Guide world where they don't necessarily consider all the organizational complexities of corporates, that's for sure. Another thing that changed is sprint planning. In the past, sprint planning really used to focus on what and how. So what do we want to achieve and how do we think we're going to get there? And that how then translates into the sprint backlog. They added the why to it as a key component. If you know Simon Sinek's golden circle, right? It's all about the why. That's the core thing. So that's why they added why to sprint planning. Why are we doing what we want to be doing in the sprint? Why are we setting out to achieve this business objective, this sprint goal? That really helps understand like where the true value is. And that conversation could lead to alterations in the what and the how, and ultimately result in more value being delivered. They also greatly simplified the language. So if you go back to the 2017 version of the Scrum Guide, I'm sure it's still out there somewhere, you'll notice that there is a lot more text for certain things, right? Something that we already discussed briefly before is refinement. That's virtually gone from the Scrum Guide now. Just mentioned in passing, as David said, it's something that should happen, just like development activities, right? According to Ken and Jeff, it doesn't belong in a Scrum Guide in that sense. And it goes to the point before, like you're going to need other things and bits and pieces in order to be successful at this. So refinement's one of those things. The 3 suggested questions for the daily Scrum were finally removed. If you go back to the 2017 version, it's there's like 3 suggested questions to ask at the daily Scrum. It's going to be, what did you achieve yesterday that contributed to the sprint goal? What are you going to achieve today? And are there any impediments? Because every daily Scrum was ran like that, and that sort of like surpassed the purpose of the daily Scrum, which is really inspection of your progress towards your sprint goal. They knocked those questions out and were like, hey, you guys figure this out. And then at the same time, virtually everybody knows those 3 questions by now, so no need for them to be in the Scrum Guide, right? Again, something that I already mentioned, removal of the 2 teams that cleared up a lot of confusion, and less prescriptive. So there's all kinds of little bits and pieces that got taken out that sort of at least gave the sense that it took away some flexibility. I wouldn't say it really did that, but they want to make sure it's really more, even more of a lightweight framework, and like you figure out what works best for you, because that's ultimately what it's all about. And less than 13 pages, so it's a lot more comprehensible. All right, so the biggest and at the same time final slide, like content slide for today's meetup. So the flow of the Scrum Framework, as you see, they have not added the commitments in here. I'm not really sure why it is. They might do it at the future. Maybe they didn't want to make them too prominent because they're not technically at the same level as the accountabilities, the artifacts, and the events. However, they are truly important. So as you see in this picture, like all the way on the left is your product backlog, that little arrow that you see over there, that circular arrow kind of thing. That's refinement right there for you. You constantly inspect and adapt and modify and refine and break up and add things to the product backlog. The product backlog is a living artifact, so it constantly changes. Constantly changes doesn't mean gets constantly overhauled. It just means it's like, especially at the bottom, some things might shift up as you pick up work out there and actually finish it and deliver it at value. And like the bigger chunks that might be in there at the bottom get broken up into smaller pieces and moving up, because the smaller something is, the easier it is to pick it up in a sprint. And that picking up in a sprint really happens in sprint planning. So sprint planning, the entire Scrum team meets, and the product owner sort of sets out the overall direction, like this is what I would prefer to achieve. Then the developers start pulling items from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. The developers are the people that are going to have to do the work, so they know best how much work they can do. So they have the final say in like what they pick up in that sprint. And then there's like a check back at the end, like, does this workload sort of get us to that sprint goal, or should we adjust the sprint goal a little bit, make sure that we can actually achieve this? Again, the sprint goal is the more important thing because that's where the value is, and what the developers say they might pick up in a sprint might change during the course of the sprint, right? The purpose of a sprint is not to finish the complete sprint backlog, it's to achieve the sprint goal. And that might even be done without completing all the items that were selected for the sprint backlog at sprint planning, right? So that could just change. There could be things you uncover during the sprint that force that change. Again, I'm saying it very loosely here. Like in my experience, sprint backlogs are fairly stable because people do typically know what's coming our way and how they should approach certain things. But there's always like 1 or 2 things that you didn't really foresee, and that can still change. And then in sprint planning, the Scrum Master guides that whole there to facilitate, to help out, to make sure that all these things happen the way they're supposed to happen. So from product backlog through sprint planning to the sprint backlog, and that's where the sprint actually starts. And the sprint is, like I said before, executed by developers. They do the work. The product owner should make sure that he or she is up to speed and in the loop about what's going on during the sprint. They should be available for questions, for resolving product-related topics and issues, for providing feedback, for making sure the right stakeholders communicate with the developers. Obviously, the Scrum Master is there to assist the development team in removing obstacles and I'd say running the events where necessary, facilitating, removing organizational issues that might arise. Part of it, majority though, are going to be the developers who do most of the work. And every day they have a daily scrum, 15 minutes or less, just a quick check-in, like what is our progress toward that sprint goal? Are we on track or are we lagging? If we're lagging, then what do we adjust to make sure that we can still achieve that sprint goal? If we're on track, good for us. If we're a lot faster than we thought, then might be like, hey, we're going to be done like 3-4 days early. Let's start talking to the product owner, see what other value we might add. Again, it shouldn't run 15 minutes. It should run at most 15 minutes. And it's really focused on that sprint goal. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's not a status update meeting. It's not a look at me, I've been very busy meeting. It can turn into all of those things, but that's really not the point. It's really focused on what do we want to do. And again, I like Samantha's comment before where she mentioned the rugby. That's really what you're doing at Huddle, right? We're making in that scrum, like we're making a plan for this attack. It's in what American football teams are, right? They make a plan in order to play this game, right? And that's what you really do in a daily scrum. Like, what's the next step? It's not about the individual, it's about the team goals. So, and then near the end of the sprint, obviously there's your sprint review. And this is where you really want to be transparent to the outside world, right? This is where a product owner typically invites a bunch of stakeholders, I would say definitely relevant stakeholders, to create transparency to them about where we are right now with the product. So you can go over what you have achieved, what value you have added and delivered over the last sprint. You can maybe even show some demos if that's feasible. And then based on all of the information, you want to collect their feedback, show them the product back, look what's coming up next. Look at like the overall market and business conditions, like is there anything else we should take into account? And then agree on like what is that next step that we're going to take? Whatever is at the top of the product backlog right now, is that still the most sensible thing? So this is really that super important feedback loop that allows for lots of agility for the team, because that's where the stakeholders have a direct say on like, are we going to go ahead as planned or do we want to adjust? This is where you're all together. This is where you're not actively working on something. This is where you've just created transparency on what's our increment, what have we just completed, where are we at right now? So this is the moment that you really want to collect that feedback. Then increment is all the way at the end, even though I said before, like increment sort of always is. If something's, if you built like a new piece of functionality according to the definition of done, then it's automatically like, if it's done, it's part of the increment. The increment is all the way at the end of this picture, because ultimately that's the whole point and the whole goal of Scrum, right? Delivering valuable increments of product. That's the whole reason you're doing this. You're not doing this because it makes your job more fun or easier. It probably does, it probably will, that's all perfectly fine. But in the end, you're doing this to deliver more value, to get happier customers, to build a better business, to generate more business. That value delivery, that's really the key singular reason why Scrum became in the first place, because that didn't used to be as good. And with this, it's probably going to do that. So, and then at the top, you see sprint retrospective. And sprint retrospective is where you have no guests, just like I'd say in the daily Scrum and sprint planning, and where you really talk about the way you collaborate, maybe even technical practices, how the sprint went, how the team synergies are, if there's any obstacles that need to be removed, and you come up with like 1, 2, 3, I don't know how many actionable improvements for the next sprint that feed straight back into sprint planning that you want to take into account. My recommendation always for sprint retrospective is making sure 1 or 2 actionable improvements at most, get those done. If you're really good at those, then you might want to generate more. But if you come up with like an action list of 10 actionable items that you want to improve during the next sprint, my experience, again, it hardly ever happens because you're focused on work. You're not fully focused on making all those process improvements. So better err on the side of caution there and pick up things or come up with actionable improvements that you're actually going to do. A lot better for the team energy and the team's happiness anyway, and pick those up rather than have like a long list and make hardly any progress. And that's sort of like the flow of the Scrum framework, right? So from product backlog through sprint planning into the sprint backlog, you start sprinting, daily Scrum, inspect and adapt, and at the end, you look back at what's been done, you get feedback, and most importantly, you look ahead. Are we still heading in the right path? And then once it's all over, you look at like, hey, how are we doing as a Scrum team and what can we improve? Good. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any additional questions. And I'm going to go back to the questions that were put out there. So Max is saying we require both QA dev groups to provide a consensus on what they can achieve beginning to end when defining a sprint and our release backlog, not just developers. Yes, and this is, again, where the term developers can sometimes cause confusion because developers includes everybody that you need in order to completely deliver that product, that increment. So if you want to do testing and you use QA for that, yes, you want to include them. If you need designers or UX people because you're working on a web application or an iOS application, I don't know, you want to include them into the process as well. Business analysts can also be part of it. Operations can also be part of it. Marketing, finance, really up to you. So Scrum really says like you need all the people to be developers, and this used to be part of the development team, but developers that you need to deliver end-to-end value for that product. Those are the people that you need in there. And Samantha's saying, actually, ideally, the team should include Dev and QA. I wish all teams were like your team, and I can only +1 that. All right, so what's a good reference book to get started with learning the fundamentals of Scrum? Mel is saying Ken Rubin's Essential Scrum. I don't know that book, Mel. I'm not sure if you want to add anything, but feel free to look it up. Maureen, if you're looking for that. The other one I want to add is called Scrum A Pocket Guide, which is a Scrum.org like official book. So if you want to go for certification, that really helps. It has a lot of hands-on experience in there. It's like a small book. It's incredibly popular. It's written by Gunther Verheyen, who is actually a Scrum expert who's worked at Scrum.org for years, who's responsible indirectly probably for changes to the Scrum Guide, also responsible for assessments and things like that. So that's another addition in that corner. So we have Ken Rubin's Essential Scrum, and then I'd say Scrum A Pocket Guide. Both are probably available on Amazon. I'm also getting an additional question. Is it a good idea for a product owner to be certified? I want to say this about certification because there's a couple of certifications out there. Certification questions out there. So again, there's 2 paths towards certification. You have the Scrum Alliance, who, again, you could take the class and then pass an assessment. And I think maybe Samantha knows this because I think you're Scrum Alliance educated. I think you have to renew that every year or every 2 years. I'm not really sure about that. And then there's Scrum.org, who have classes, but you can also just purchase the assessment and take the assessment. And though once you pass that, that certification is valid indefinitely. So yeah, Scrum Alliance, you have to renew it every 2 years. Scrum.org, it's valid indefinitely. The 2 other differences are, one of the other big differences, sorry, is that Scrum Alliance gives trainers a lot of freedom as to how they want to present the class and the curriculum of that class. And Scrum.org is fairly strict with regards to this is the curriculum that we're going to send out there. So some larger, and again, I'm a Scrum.org PST, so a little disclaimer there, a little nuance. So Scrum.org really positions that as a unique selling point because it's consistent across classes. Now back to the original the question about, is certification desirable? The whole point about certifications are good for your resume, right? Certain organizations require them, so it never really hurts to have that certification, especially if you purchase them separately. They're $150 or something along those lines. So it's not like the biggest investment on the planet either. The bigger part of certification are typically those classes, right? Those classes help you prepare for the certification. And the value of those classes is that not only are they like a very big injection of theoretical knowledge, there's also a whole lot of experience in those classes. Whether it be Scrum Alliance or Scrum.org, all these trainers have a lot of Scrum experience. They are all being vetted very, very thoroughly if they have that experience, if they are in a position to actually teach this. So whichever class you go to, you are being taught by a Scrum professional with lots of experience, and all that experience, I'd say, that is definitely helpful in your further role development. When I became a Scrum Master, I really got a huge boost from taking a class because it didn't, again, not only did it inject lots of knowledge, you get additional experience from the trainer, and you get a lot of additional experience from the other participants in the class. So that's really where the true value of those classes is. So you could even argue you could take the class without necessarily going for the certification because the class itself provides value, right? And whichever one you choose, obviously, if you're going to ask me, I'm going to suggest the Scrum.org class. But if you ask somebody else, it might be Scrum Alliance. I'd say the biggest question, if you're considering certification, is do I just want to get the certification for my resume because I do have that experience, or do I really want to build that experience and add that certification? Because if you want to build that experience, take a class. If you just want to get the certification, find a way to get certified out there. There are other certifying bodies, right? In my experience, though, CSM, so Scrum Alliance, and PSM, Scrum.org, and all their other certifications are seen as the industry standards. So other certifications might provide value, but it's based on what I'm hearing and seeing from organizations and people applying for jobs, not as much as the Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. All right, so going back to the chat here, a little bit of activity here. Mimi is saying you can take free certification of Scrum fundamentals through Scrum Study. I just did. That's one of those other parties I refer to. So you can go out there. Again, for resume boosters are typically Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. Samantha's rightly saying there's also SAFe, a Scaled Agile framework. They do have, I think it's Scrum Master Product Owner, Scrum Master Product. No, they actually have like a SAFe specific, Scaled Agile specific Scrum Master class in there. So if you're in a large organization, part of a Scaled Agile transformation, I know, for example, there's one happening inside Bank of America. I think Chevron's doing them, Boeing's doing them, and lots of other organizations as well. Then you might go the SAFe path in addition to the other ones. So just throwing it out there. And then it goes sort of like more into Scaled Agile, but I want to hear back from that. So, all right. I want to pause here to see if there's some final questions about Scrum itself. And then obviously after, we're free to chat about all the other things and maybe a little bit more scaling. All right, I am not seeing a lot of questions. So in case you want to hang around and ask some questions, be it to me personally or to the group, that's all perfectly fine. If you want to drop off, that's perfectly fine too. Obviously, I do want to thank you for being here. I'm going to be relocating probably over the course of April. So the next meetup is going to be in May. I will announce it as soon as I have some clarity on the timeline, but very, very likely going to be mid-May, and topic has to be determined, but very strong inclination towards combining Scrum and Kanban. So keep your eyes out for the meetup page. I'm also going to get a colleague who is likely going to pick up a couple of these meetups, or we're going to do it in tandem. Not really sure about how that's going to work yet, but there's definitely some exciting stuff in the pipeline, which I'm going to be telling you about more in the future. So next meetup is going to be May. Keep an eye on the meetup page. And again, thank you very much for being here. The recording will be shared tomorrow. The slides will be shared tomorrow. And if you want to stay in the loop about what we're doing, Lucy is actually drawing something. Lucy from Toronto. If you want to keep in the loop, follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to the newsletter, and there's my contact information in case you do have any follow-up questions. I'm always happy to chat. And I see a fellow Dutchman here, Jan, I should say. Thanks very much for being here. Definitely appreciate it.
Hey, Martin, it's Lucy.
Hey, Lucy.
Sorry about that. I saw a new icon, and I had to touch it.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Quick question for you. I joined really late. I just realized you guys were on. Listen, what's the top 2 or top 3 things that changed in 2020?